Keepers of the Lost Cities by Shannon Messenger. Preface. Blurry, fractured memories swam through Sophie's mind, but she couldn't piece them together. She tried opening her eyes and found only darkness. Something rough pressed against her wrists and ankles, refusing to let her move. A wave of cold rushed through her as the horrifying realization dawned. She was a hostage. A cloth across her lips stifled her cry for help, and a sedative sweet aroma stung to her nose when she inhaled, making her head spin. Were they going to kill her? Would the Black Swan really destroy their own creation? What was the point of Project Moonlark then? What was the point of the Everblades? The drug lulled her towards a dreamless oblivion, but she fought back, clinging to the one memory she could shine a tiny spot of light in the thick, inky haze. A pair of beautiful aquamarine eyes. Fitz's eyes. Her first friend in her new life. Her first friend ever. Maybe if she hadn't noticed him in the day before the museum, none of this would happen. No, she knew it had been too late even then. The white fires were already burning, curving towards her city and filling the sky with sticky, sweet smoke. The spark before the blaze. Chapter 1. Miss Foster, Mr. Sweeney's nasal voice cut through Sophie's blaring music as he yanked her earbuds out by the cords. Have you decided that you're too smart to pay attention to this information? Sophie forced her eyes open. She tried not to wince as the bright fluorescence reflected off the vivid blue walls of the museum, amplifying the throbbing headache she was hiding. No, Mr. Sweeney, she mumbled, shrinking under the glares of her now staring classmates. She pulled her shoulder-length blonde hair around her face, wishing she could hide behind it. This was exactly the kind of attention she went out of her way to avoid, why she wore dull colors and lurked in the back, blocked by the other kids who were at least a foot taller than her. It was the only way to survive as a 12-year-old high school senior. Then perhaps you can explain why you were listening to your iPod instead of following along. Mr. Sweeney held up her earbuds like they were evidence in a crime, though to him they probably were. He dragged Sophie's class to the Natural History Museum in Balboa Park, assuming his students would be excited about the all-day field trip. He didn't seem to realize that unless the giant dinosaur replicas came to life and started eating people, no one cared. Sophie tugged out a loose eyelash, a nervous habit, and stared at her feet. There was no way to make Mr. Sweeney understand why she needed the music to cancel the noise. He couldn't even hear the noise. Chatter from dozens of tourists echoed off the fossil-lined walls and splashed around the cavernous room, but their mental voices were the real problem. Scattered, disconnected pieces of thoughts broadcast straight into Sophie's brain, like being in a room with hundreds of TVs blaring different shows at the same time. They sliced into her consciousness, leaving sharp pains in their wake. She was a freak. It had been her secret, her burden, since she fell and hit her head when she was 5 years old. She tried blocking the noise, tried ignoring it. Nothing helped. And she could never tell anyone. They wouldn't understand. Since you've decided that you're above this lecture, why don't you give it? Mr. Sweeney asked. He pointed to the enormous orange dinosaur with a duck bill in the center of the room. Explain to the class how the Lambeosaurus differs from the other dinosaurs we've studied. Sophie repressed a sigh as her mind flashed to an image of the information card in front of the display. She glanced at it when they entered the museum, and her photographic memory recorded every detail. As she recited the facts, Mr. Sweeney's face twisted into a scowl, and she could hear her classmates' thoughts growing increasingly sour. They weren't exactly fans of the resident child prodigy. They called her a curve buster. She finished her answer, and Mr. Sweeney grumbled something that sounded like know-it-all, as he stalked off to the exhibit in the next room over. Sophie didn't follow. The thin wall separating the two rooms didn't block the noise, but they muffled it. She grabbed what little relief she could. Nice job, super freak. Garwin Chang, a boy wearing a t-shirt that said "Back off, I'm gonna fart," sneered as he shoved past her to join their classmates. Maybe they'll write another article about you. Child prodigy teaches class about the Lamosaurus. Garwin was still bitter Yale had offered her a full scholarship. His rejection letter had arrived a few weeks before. Not that Sophie was allowed to go. Her parents said it was too much attention, too much pressure, and she was too young. End of discussion. So, she'd be attending the much closer, much smaller San Diego City College next year, a fact some annoying reporter found newsworthy enough to post in the local paper the day before. Child prodigy chooses City College over Ivy League, complete with her senior photo. Her parents freaked when they found it. Freaked wasn't even a strong enough word. More than half the rules were to help Sophie avoid unnecessary attention. Front page articles were pretty much their worst nightmare. They'd even called the newspaper to complain. The editors seemed unhappy as they were. The story was run in place of an article that on the arsonist terrorizing the city, and they were still trying to figure out how the mistake had happened. Bizarre fires with white-hot flames and smoke that smelled like burnt sugar took priority over everything, especially a story about an unimportant girl most people went out of their way to ignore. Or they used to. Across the museum, Sophie caught sight of a tall, dark-haired boy reading yesterday's newspaper with the embarrassing black and white photo of her in the front. Then he looked up and stared straight at her. She'd never seen eyes that particular shade of blue before. Teal, like the smooth pieces of sea glass she'd found on the beach, and they were so bright they glittered. Something flickered across his expression when he caught her gaze. Disappointment? Before she could decide of what to make of it, he shrugged off the display he'd been leaning against and closed the distance between them. The smile he flashed belonged on a movie screen, and Sophie's heart did a weird fluttery thing. Is this you? He asked, pointing to the picture. Sophie nodded, feeling tongue-tied. He was probably 15, and by far the cutest boy she'd ever seen. So why was he talking to her? I thought so. He squinted at the picture and back at her. I didn't realize your eyes were brown. Yeah, she said, not sure what to say. Why? He shrugged. No reason. Something felt off about their conversation, but she couldn't figure out what it was, and she couldn't place his accent. Kind of British, but different somehow. Was it crisper? Which bothered her, but she didn't know why. Are you in this class? She asked, wishing she could suck the words back as soon as they left her mouth. Of course he wasn't in their class. She'd never seen him before. She wasn't used to talking to boys, especially cute boys, and it made her brain a little mushy. His perfect smile returned as he told her, no. Then he pointed to the hulking greenish figure they were standing in front of, an Albertosaurus in all its giant, lizardesque glory. Tell me something. Do you really think that's what they looked like? It's a little absurd, isn't it? Not really, Sophie said, trying to see what he saw. It looked like a small T-Rex with a big mouth, sharp teeth, and ridiculously short arms. Seemed fine to her. Why? What do you think they looked like? He laughed. Never mind. I'll let you get back to your class. It was nice to meet you, Sophie. He turned to leave just as two classes of kindergarteners barreled into the fossil exhibit. The crushing wave of screaming voices was enough to knock Sophie back a step, but their mental voices were a whole other realm of pain. Kit's thoughts were stinging, high-pitched needles, and so many at once was like an angry porcupine attacking her brain. Sophie closed her eyes as her hands darted to her head, rubbing her temples to ease the stabbings in her skull. Then she remembered she wasn't alone. She glanced around to see if anyone noticed her reaction and locked eyes with the boy. His hands were at his forehead, and his face wore the same pained expression she had imagined she had only a few seconds before. Did you just hear that? He asked, his voice hushed. She felt the blood drain from her face. He couldn't mean... It had to be the screaming kids. They created plenty of racket on their own. Shrieks and squeals and giggles, plus 60 or so individual voices chattering away. Voices. She gasped and took another step back as her brain solved her earlier problem. She could hear the thoughts of everyone in the room, but she couldn't hear the boy's distinct, accented voice unless he was speaking. His mind was totally and completely silent. She didn't know that was possible. Who are you? She whispered. His eyes widened. You didn't you? He moved closer, leaning in to whisper. Are you a telepath? She flinched. The word made her skin itch, and her reaction gave her away. You are! I can't believe it, he whispered. Sophie backed towards the exit. She wasn't about to reveal her secret to a total stranger. It's okay, he said, holding his hands out as he moved closer, and she was some sort of wild animal he was trying to calm. You don't have to be afraid. I'm one too. Sophie froze. My name's Fitz, he added, stepping closer still. Fitz? What kind of a name was Fitz? She studied his face, searching for some sign that this was all part of a joke. I'm not joking, he said, like he knew exactly what she was thinking. Maybe he did. She wobbled on her feet. She'd spent the past 7 years wishing she could just find someone else like her, someone who could do what she could. Now that she found him, she felt like the world had tilted sideways. He grabbed her arms to steady her. It's okay, Sophie. I'm here to help you. We've been looking for you for 12 years. 12 years? And what did he mean by we? Better question. What did he want with her? The walls closed in and the room started to spin. Air. She needed air. She jerked away and bolted through the door, stumbling as her shaky legs found their rhythm. She sucked in giant breaths as she ran down the stairs to the front of the museum. The smoke from the fires burned her lungs and white bits of ash flew into her face, but she ignored them. She wanted as much space between her and the strange boy as possible. Sophie, come back! Fitz shouted behind her. She picked up her pace as she raced through the courtyard at the base of the steps, past the wide fountain and over the grassy knolls to the sidewalk. No one got in her way. Everyone was inside because of the poor air quality, but she could still hear his footsteps gaining on her. Wait, Fitz called. You don't have to be afraid. She ignored him, pouring all of her energy into her sprint and fighting the urge to glance over her shoulder to see how far back he was. She made it halfway through a crosswalk before the sound of screeching tires reminded her she hadn't looked both ways. Her head turned as she locked eyes with the terrified driver struggling to stop his car before it plowed right over her. She was going to die. Chapter 2. The next second was a blur. The car swerved right, missing Sophie by inches, then jumped the curb and sideswept the streetlight. The heavy steel lantern cracked from its base and plummeted towards Sophie. No! It was her only thought as her instincts took over. Her hand shot into the air, the mind pulling strength from somewhere deep in her gut and pushing it out through her fingertips. She felt the force collide with the falling lantern, gripping onto it like it was an extension of her arm. As the dust settled, she looked up and gasped. The bright blue lantern floated above her, somehow held up by her mind. It didn't feel heavy, though. She was sure it weighed a ton. Put it down, a familiar accented voice warned, bringing her out of her trance. She shrieked and dropped her arm without thinking. The streetlight hurtled toward them. Watch out! Fitz shouted, yanking her out of the way a split second before the lantern crashed to the ground. The force of the impact knocked them over, and they tumbled to the sidewalk. Fitz's body broke her fall as she landed across his chest. Time seemed to stop. She stared into his eyes that were now stretched as wide as they could go, trying to sort through the flurry of thoughts and questions swirling around in her head to find something coherent. How did you do that? He whispered. I have no idea. She sat up, replaying the past few seconds in her mind. Nothing made sense. We need to get out of here, Fitz warned, pointing to the driver, who was staring at them like he'd witnessed a miracle. He saw, she gasped, feeling her chest tighten with panic. Fitz pulled her to her feet and as he got up, Come on, let's get out of sight. She was too overwhelmed to figure out a plan of her own, so she didn't resist when he dragged her down the street. Which way? He asked as they reached the first intersection. She didn't want to be alone with him, so she pointed north, toward the San Diego Zoo, where there was sure to be a crowd, even during a firestorm. They took off running, though no one was following, and for the first time in her life, Sophie missed hearing thoughts. She had no idea what Fitz wanted, and it changed everything. Her mind ran through terrifying scenarios, most of which involved the government agent throwing her into dark vans to run experiment on her. She watched the road, ready to bolt at the first sign of anything suspicious. They reached the zoo's massive parking lot, and Sophie relaxed when she saw people outside, milling around their cars. Nothing would happen with so many witnesses. She slowed her pace to a walk. What do you want? She asked when she caught her breath. I'm here to help you, I promise. His voice sounded sincere. Didn't make it easier to believe him, though. Why were you looking for me? She tugged at a loose eyelash, more than a little afraid of the answer. He opened his mouth, then hesitated. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to tell you. How am I supposed to trust you if you won't answer my questions? He considered that for a second. Okay, fine, but I don't know much. My father sent me to find you. We've been looking for a specific girl your age, and I was supposed to observe you and report back to him, like always. I wasn't supposed to talk to you. He frowned, like he was disappointed with himself. I just couldn't figure you out. You don't make sense. What does that mean? It means you're different from what I expected. Your eyes really threw me off. What's wrong with my eyes? She touched her eyelids, suddenly self-conscious. We all have blue eyes, so when I saw them, I figured we had the wrong girl again, but we didn't. He looked at her with something like of awe. You're really one of us. She stopped and held up her hands. Whoa, hang on. What do you mean, one of us? He glanced over his shoulder, frowning when he spotted a crowd of fanny pack-wearing tourists within earshot. He pulled her towards a deserted corner of the parking lot, ducking behind a dark green minivan. Okay, there's no easy way to explain this, so I'm just going to say it. We're not human, Sophie. For a second, she was too stunned to speak. Then a hysterical laugh escaped her lips. Not human, she repeated, shaking her head. Right. Where are you going? He asked as she moved toward the sidewalk. You're insane, and I'm insane for trusting you. She kicked the ground as she stomped away. I'm telling the truth, he called. Just think for a minute, Sophie. The last thing she wanted to do was listen to another word he said, but the plea in his voice made her stop and face him. Could humans do this? He closed his eyes and vanished. He was only gone for a second, but it was enough to leave her reeling. She leaned against the car, feeling everything spin around her. But I can't do that, she argued, taking deep breaths to clear her head. You have no idea what you can do when you set your mind to it. Think of what you did with that pole a few minutes ago. He seemed so sure, and it almost made sense. But how could that be? And if she wasn't human, what was she? Chapter 3. So, what? Sophie managed to say when she finally found her voice. You're saying I'm an alien? She held her breath. Fitz erupted into laughter. Her cheeks grew hot, but she was also relieved. She didn't want to be an alien. No, he said when he managed to compose himself. I'm saying you're an elf. An elf. The word hung in the air between them, a foreign object that didn't belong. An elf, she repeated. Visions of little people in tights with pointy ears danced through her brain, and she couldn't help giggling. You don't believe me? Did you really expect me to? I guess not. He ran his hands through his hair, making it stick out in wavy spikes, kinda like a rock star. Could someone that good looking be crazy? I'm telling you the truth, Sophie. I don't know what else to say. Okay, she agreed. If he refused to be serious, so would she. Fine, I'm an elf. Am I supposed to help Frodo destroy the ring and save Middle-earth? Or do I have to make toys in the North Pole? He let out a sigh, but a smile hid in the corners of his mouth. Would it help if I showed you? Oh, sure. This ought to be good. She folded her arms as he pulled out a slender silver wand with intricate carvings etched into the sides. At the tip, a small, round crystal sparkled in the sunlight. Is that your magic wand? She couldn't resist asking. He rolled his eyes. Actually, it's a pathfinder. He spun the crystal and it locked into place with a silver latch at the top. Now, this can be dangerous. Do you promise you'll do exactly what I tell you to? Her smile faded. That depends. What do I have to do? You need to take my hand and concentrate on holding on. And by concentrate, I mean you can't think about anything else, no matter what happens. Can you do that? Why? Do you want proof or not? She wanted to say no, because he couldn't actually prove anything. I mean, what was he going to do? Whisk her away to some magic elf land? But she was curious. And really, what harm could come from holding someone's hand? She willed her palms not to sweat as their fingers laced together. Her heart did that stupid fluttery thing again, and her hand tingled everywhere their skin touched. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the parking lot again. Okay, we're alone. We go on three. Are you ready? What happens on three? He shot her a warning look, and she scowled at him. But she bit her tongue and concentrated on holding his hand, ignoring her racing heart. Seriously, when did she become one of those silly girls? One, he counted, raising the wand. Sunlight hit a facet in the crystal, and a bright beam refracted towards the ground. Two. He tightened his grip. Sophie closed her eyes. Three. Fitz pulled her forward, and the warm tingling in her hand shot through her body like a million feathers swelling underneath her skin, tickling her from the inside out. She fought off a giggle and concentrated on Fitz, but where was he? She knew he was clinging to him, but it felt like her body had melted into goo, and the only thing keeping her from oozing away was a blanket of warmth wrapped around her. Then, faster than a blink of an eye, the warmth faded, and she opened her eyes. Her mouth fell open as she tried to take it all in. She might have even squeaked. She stood at the edge of a glassy river lined with impossibly tall trees, fanning out their wide, emerald leaves among the puffy white clouds. Across the river, a row of crystal castles glistened in the sunlight in a way that would make Walt Disney want to throw rocks at his magic kingdom. To her right, a golden path led into a sprawling city, where elaborate dome buildings seemed to be built from brick-sized jewels, each structure a different color. Snow-capped mountains surrounded the lush valley, and the crisp, cool air smelled like cinnamon and chocolate and sunshine. Places this beautiful weren't supposed to exist, much less appear out of thin air. You can let go of my hand now. Sophie jumped. She'd forgotten about Fitz. Her hand released his, and as the blood tingled in her fingertips, she realized how hard she'd been squeezing. She looked around, unable to make sense of anything she saw. The castle towers twisted like spun sugar, and something seemed oddly familiar about them, but she couldn't figure out what it was. Where are we? Our capital. We call it Eternalia, but you might have heard it called Shangri-La before. Shangri-La, she repeated, shaking her head. Shangri-La is real? All of the lost cities are real, but not how you'd picture them, I'm sure. Human stories rarely get anything right. Think of all the ridiculous things you've heard about elves. She had to laugh at that, and a sharp burst of sound echoed off the trees. It was so quiet there, just the gentle breeze brushing her face, and the soft murmur of the river. No traffic, no chatter, no hammering. No unspoken thoughts. She could get very used to the silence, but it felt strange too, like something was missing. Where is everyone? She asked, rising on her tiptoes to get a better view of the city. The streets were a ghost town. Fitz pointed to a domed building that towered over all of the others. The green stones of its walls looked like giant emeralds, but for some reason the building sparkled less than all of the others. It looked like a serious place for serious things. See that blue banner flying? That means a tribunal is in process. Everyone's watching the proceedings. A tribunal? When the council, basically a royalty, holds a hearing to decide if someone's breaking a law, they're kind of a big deal when they happen. Why? He shrugged. Laws are rarely ever broken. Well, that was different. Humans broke the law all the time. She shook her head. Was she really thinking of humans as something other? But how else could she explain where she was? She tried to wrap her mind around the idea, tried to force it to make sense. So, she said, cringing over her ridiculous next question, this is magic? Fitz laughed, a full body laugh, like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. She glared at him. It couldn't be that funny. No, he said when he regained control. Magic is a stupid idea humans came up with to try to explain things they couldn't understand. Okay, she said, trying to cling to the remaining strands of her sanity. Then how can we be here when 5 minutes ago we were in San Diego? He held up the Pathfinder to the sun, casting a ray of light onto his hand. Light leaping. We hitched a ride on a beam of light that was headed straight here. That's impossible. Is it? Yeah, you need infinite energy for light travel. Haven't you heard the theory of relativity? She thought she had stumped him but with that one, but he just laughed again. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Who came up with that? Uh, Albert Einstein? Huh, never heard of him, but he was wrong. He'd never heard of Albert Einstein? The theory of relativity was dumb? She wasn't sure how to argue. He seemed so ridiculously confident, it was unnerving. Concentrate harder this time, he said, as he grabbed her hand again. She closed her eyes and waited for the warm feather sensation, but this time it was like someone had turned on a hair dryer and sent the feathers scattering in a million directions, until another force wrapped around her and pulled everything back together again like a giant rubber band. A second later she was shivering from a cold ocean breeze whipping her hair around her face. Fitz pointed to the massive castle in front of them, which glowed like the stones were carved from moonlight. How do you think we got here? Words failed her. And it really felt like the light passed through her, pulling her along with it. But she couldn't bring herself to say it, because if that was true, every single science book she'd read was wrong. You look confused, he observed. Well, it's like you're saying, hey, Sophie, take everything you've learned about anything and throw it away. Actually, that is what I'm saying. He flashed a smug grin. Humans do the best they can, but their minds can't begin to comprehend the complexities of reality. And what? Elves' minds are better? Of course. Why do you think you're so far ahead of your class? The slowest elf can still trump a human, even one with no proper education. Her shoulders sagged as Fitz's words sank in. If he was right, she was just some stupid girl who knew nothing about anything. No, not a girl. An elf. Chapter 4. The scenery blurred, but whether it was from tears or panic, Sophie couldn't be sure. Everything she knew was wrong. Her entire life was a lie. Fitz nudged her arm. Hey, it's not your fault. You believed what they taught you. I'm sure I'd have done the same thing. But it's time you knew the truth. This is how the world really works. It's not magic. It's just how it is. The castle bells chimed, and Fitz yanked her behind a large rock as a gateway opened. Two elves with floor-length velvet capes draped over their black tunics emerged, followed by dozens of bizarre creatures marching in military formation down the rocky path. They were at least 7 feet tall and wore only black pants, leaving their thick muscles prominently on display. With their flat noses and coarse, gray skin, which fell in pleated folds, they looked part alien, part armadillo. Goblins, Fitz whispered. Probably the most dangerous creatures you'll ever meet, which is why good thing they signed the treaty. Then why are we hiding? She whispered, hating her voice for trembling. We're just like humans. Humans are forbidden in the Lost Cities, especially here in Luminaria. Luminaria is where all the other worlds come together. Gnomes, dwarves, ogres, goblins, and trolls. She was too overwhelmed to even think about the other creatures he was mentioning, so she focused on a better question. Why are humans forbidden? He motioned for her to follow him to a rock farther away, squatting behind it. They betrayed us. The ancient counselors offered them the same treaty they made with all the intelligent creatures, and they agreed. Then, they decided they wanted to rule the world, like it even works that way, and started planning a war. The ancients didn't want violence, so they disappeared, forbid any contact with humans, and left them to their own devices. You can see how well that's working out for them. Sophie opened her mouth to defend her race, but she could see Fitz's point. War, crime, famine, the humans had a lot of problems. Plus, if everything he said was saying was true, they weren't her race. The realization chilled her much more than the frigid wind licking her cheeks. The stories told by the humans who'd known us must have sounded impossible after we disappeared, and eventually they've evolved into the crazy myths you've heard. But this is the truth, Sophie. Fitz pointed around them. This is who you are. This is where you belong. Where you belong. She waited for her whole life to hear those three simple words. I'm really an elf? She whispered. Yes. Sophie peeked through the rocks at the glowing castle, a place that wasn't supposed to exist, but somehow right in front of her. Everything he was telling her was insane, but she knew it was true. She could feel it, like a crucial piece of her identity had clicked into place. Okay, she decided, her head spinning in 1,000 directions. I believe you. A loud clang sounded as another gate closed. Fitz stepped out of the shadows and pulled it out into a different world. No Pathfinder, sleek and black with a cobalt blue crystal. Ready to go home? Home. The word jolted her back to reality. Mr. Sweeney would call her mom when she didn't get on the bus. She needed to get home before her mom freaked. Her heart sank a little. Reality seemed so bland and boring after everything she'd seen. Still, she took his hand and stole one last look at the incredible view before the blinding light swept it away. The smoky ash stung her lungs after the crisp, fresh air of Luminaria. Sophie looked around, surprised to recognize the plain square houses on the narrow, tree-lined street. They were 1 block away from her house. She decided not to ask how he knew where she lived. Fitz coughed and glared at the sky. You think humans could handle putting out a few fires before the smoke pollutes the whole planet? They're working on it, she said, feeling a strange need to defend her home. Plus, these aren't normal fires. The arsonist used some sort of chemical when he started them, so they're burning white hot, and the smoke smells sweet. Usually, wildfires made the city smell like barbecue. This time, it was more like melting cotton candy, which is actually kind of nice, if it didn't burn her eyes and rain ash. Arsonists. Fitz shook his head. Why would anyone want to watch the world burn? I don't know, she admitted. She asked herself the same question, and she wasn't sure there was an answer. Fitz pulled the silver Pathfinder out of his pocket. Are you leaving? She asked, hoping he didn't notice the way her voice hitched. I have to find out what my dad wants to do now, even if he knows. Neither of us thought you're going to be the girl. The girl. Like she was someone important. If she could hear his thoughts, she knew what he meant, but his mind was still a silent mystery, and she had still no idea why. He's not going to be happy I took you to our cities, he added, even though I was careful no one saw us. So please, don't tell anyone anything I've shown you today. I won't. I promise. She held his gaze so he knew she meant it. He released the breath he'd been holding. Thank you. And be sure to act normal so your family doesn't suspect anything. She nodded, but she had to ask one question before he left. Fitz? She squared her shoulders for courage. Why can't I hear your thoughts? The question knocked him back a step. I still can't believe you're a telepath. Aren't all elves telepaths? No, it's a special ability, one of the rarer ones. And you're only 12, right? I'll be 13 in 6 months, she corrected, not liking the way he said only. That's really young. They said I was the youngest to manifest, and I didn't start reading minds until I was 13. She frowned. But I've been hearing thoughts since I was 5. 5? He said it so loud it reverberated off the house, and they both scanned the street to make sure no one was around. You sure? He whispered. Positive. Waking up in the hospital after she hit her head wasn't the kind of moment she could forget. She was hooked up to all kinds of crazy machines with her parents hovering over her, shouting things she could barely separate from the voices filling her mind. All she could do was cry and hold her head and try to explain what was happening as a group of adults who didn't understand, who would never understand. No one could make the noise go away, and the voices had haunted her ever since. Is that wrong? She asked, not liking the worry etched between his brows. I have no idea. His eyes narrowed, like he was trying to see inside her head. What are you doing? Are you blocking me? He asked, ignoring her question. I don't even know what that is. She stepped away, wishing the extra space could stop him from reading her private thoughts. It's a way to keep telepaths out, kind of like putting a wall around your mind. Is that why I can't hear you? Maybe. Can you tell me what I'm thinking right now? I told you, I don't hear your thoughts the way I do with other people. That's because humans have weak minds, but that's not what I meant. If you listen, can you hear me? I don't know. I've never tried to read a mind before. You just have to trust your instincts. Concentrate. You'll know what to do. Just try. She hated being bossed around, especially since he wasn't answering her questions. Then again, what he wanted her to do might be the only way to find out why he looked so concerned. She just had to figure out what he meant by listen. She didn't have to tell her ears to hear, they just did, but listening took action. She had to concentrate. Maybe mind reading worked the same way, like an extra sense. She focused on his forehead, imagining that she was stretching out her consciousness like a mental shadow, feeling for his thoughts. After a second, Fitz's voice swept through her head. It wasn't sharp or loud like human thoughts, more of a soft whisper brushing across her brain. You've never felt a mind quite as mine? She blurted. You heard me? He looked pale. Was I not supposed to? No one else can. She needed a few seconds to process that. And you can't read my mind? He shook his head. Not even when I try my hardest. A whole new world of worries pressed on her shoulders. She didn't want to be different from other elves. Why? I have no idea, but when you pair it with your eyes and where you live. He stopped, like he was afraid he'd said too much, and then fumbled with the crystal on his pathfinder. I need to ask my dad. Well, wait, you can't leave now. Not when she had more questions than answers. I have to go. I've already been too long, and you need to get home. She knew he was right. She didn't want to get in trouble, but her knees still shook as he held the crystal to the sunlight. He was her only link to the amazing world she'd seen, the only proof that she hadn't imagined the whole thing. Will I ever see you again? She whispered. Of course. I'll be back tomorrow. How will I find you? He flashed a smile. Don't worry. I'll find you. Chapter 5. There you are, her mom shouted. Her panicked thoughts battered their way into Sophie's brain as she entered their cluttered living room and found her mom still on the phone. Yes, she's home now, she said into the receiver. Don't worry, I'll be having a very long talk with her. Sophie's heart jolted. Her mom hung up the phone and reeled around. Her wide green eyes glared daggers. That was Mr. Sweeney calling because he couldn't find you at the museum. What were you thinking, wandering off like that, especially now with the fires making everyone nervous? Do you have any idea how worried I was? And Mr. Sweeney was about to call the police. I'm sorry, Sophie stammered, struggling to find a convincing lie. She was a horrible liar. I got scared. Her mom's anger faded into concern, and she tugged nervously at her curly brown hair. Scared of what? Did something happen? I saw this guy, Sophie said, realizing the best lies are based on the truth. He had this article about me. He started asking all these questions, and it was freaking me out, so I ran away from him. And then I was scared to go back, so I walked to the trolley and took the train home. Why don't you get a teacher, a museum guard, or call the police? I guess I didn't think of that. I just wanted to get away. She took out an eyelash. Ugh, stop doing that, her mom complained, closing her eyes and shaking her head. She took a deep breath. Well, I guess the most important thing is that you're okay. But if anything like that ever happens again, I want you to run straight to an adult. Do you understand? Sophie nodded. Good. She rubbed the wrinkle between her brows that always appeared when she was stressed. This is exactly why your father and I were upset about that article. It's not safe for you to stand out in this world. You never know what some weirdo's going to try to do once they know where they can find you. No one understood the dangers of standing out better than Sophie. She'd been teased and tormented and bullied her whole life. I'm fine, Mom. Okay? Her mom seemed to deflate as she let out a heavy sigh. I know, I just wish... Her voice trailed off and Sophie closed her eyes, hoping she could close out the rest of that thought. You could be normal, like your sister. The words slipped in like a tiny pin into Sophie's heart. It was the hardest part of being a telepath, hearing what her parents really thought. She knew her mom didn't mean it, but it didn't make it any less painful to hear. Her mom wrapped her in a tight hug. Just be careful, Sophie. I don't know what I'd do if anything happened to you. I know, Mom. I'll try. Her dad came through the front door and let her mom go. Welcome home, honey. I'll have dinner ready in 10, she called him. And Amy, she added, raising her voice so it could be heard upstairs, time to come down. Sophie followed her mom into the kitchen, feeling an unease in her stomach. Worn linoleum, pastel walls, tacky knickknacks, it all seemed so ordinary after the glittering cities Fitz had shown her. Could she really belong there? Did she really belong there? Sophie's dad kissed her on the cheek as he set a shabby briefcase on the kitchen table. And how's my soybean? He asked with a wink. Sophie scowled. He'd been calling her that since she was a baby. Apparently, she'd had a hard time pronouncing her name, and she'd asked him hundreds, no thousands of times to stop. He refused to listen. Her mom took the lid off of one of the simmering pots, and the smell of garlic and cream filled the room. She handed Sophie the silverware. It's your turn to set the table. Yeah, soybean, get crackin', her sister said as she scooted into the room and plopped into her usual chair. At 9 years old, Amy already had the annoying sister role mastered. Amy was Sophie's opposite in every single way, from her curly brown hair and green eyes to her lower than average grades and incredible popularity. No one understood how she and Sophie could be sisters, especially Sophie. Even their parents wondered about it in their thoughts. The silverware slipped through Sophie's fingers. What's wrong? Her mom asked. Nothing. She sank into her chair. How could she and Amy be sisters? Amy was definitely human. Her parents, too. She'd heard enough of their thoughts to know they weren't hiding any secret powers. And if she was an elf... The room spun and she lowered her head into her hands. She tried to concentrate on breathing. Inhale, exhale, and repeat. You okay, Soybean? Her dad asked. For once, she didn't care about the nickname. I feel kinda dizzy. Must be from the smoke, she added, trying not to make them suspicious. Can I go lay down? I think you should eat something first, her mom said, and Sophie knew she couldn't argue. Skipping dinner was definitely not acting normal, especially on fettuccine night. It was her favorite, but the rich sauce did not help her sudden nausea. Neither did the way her family stared at her. Sophie ignored their mental concern, trying not to tug on their eyelashes as she chewed each bite and forced herself to swallow. Finally, her dad set his fork down, the official end of dinner in the Foster house, and Sophie jumped to her feet. Thanks, Mom. That was great. I'm gonna go do some homework. She left the kitchen and sprinted up the stairs before they could say anything to stop her. She raced to her room and closed the door, stumbling to her bed. A loud hiss shattered the silence. Sorry, Marty, she whispered, her heart pounding in her ears. Her fluffy gray cat glared at her for sitting on his tail, but she reached out her hand and he slunk towards her, settling into her lap. Marty's gentle purring filled the silence and gave her courage to confront the realization she'd made downstairs. Her family couldn't be her family. She took a deep breath and let the reality settle in. The strange thing was, in some ways, it made sense. It explained why she felt so out of place around them, the slender blonde among the chubby brunette family. Still, they were the only family she knew, and if they weren't her family, who was? Panic closed off her chest as her lungs screamed for air, but another pain throbbed deeper, like something inside had ripped apart. Her eyes burned with tears, but she blinked them back. It had to be a mistake. How could she not be related to her family? She'd been hearing their thoughts for 7 years. How could she not know that? And even if it was somehow possible, not being related to them didn't change anything, did it? A lot of kids were adopted, and they were part of their new family. Her mom poked her head through the door. I bought you some EL fudges. She handed Sophie a plate of her favorite cookies and a glass of milk, then frowned. You look pale, Sophie. Are you getting sick? She pressed her palm against Sophie's forehead. You don't have a fever. I'm fine. I'm just tired. She reached for a cookie but froze when she saw his tiny elf face. I need to go to bed. Her mom left her alone so she could change. She stumbled through her routine and crawled under the blankets, wrapping them as tight as they would go. Marty took her place on her pillow next to her head. Sweet dreams, Soybean, her dad said, kissing her on the forehead. Her parents always tucked her in, another foster family tradition. Night, Dad. She tried to smile but could barely breathe. Her mom kissed Sophie's cheek. Do you have Ella? Yep. She showed her the blue elephant tucked under her arm. She was probably too old to have a stuffed animal, but she couldn't sleep without Ella. Tonight she needed her more than ever. Her mom turned off the light, and the darkness gave Sophie the courage she needed. Can I ask you guys something? Sure, her dad said. What's up? She hugged Ella tighter. Was I adopted? Her mom laughed as her mind flashed the 12 hours of the very painful labor she'd endured. No, Sophie. Why would you ask that? Could I have been switched at birth? No, of course not. Are you sure? Yes, I think I'd know my own daughter. There wasn't a doubt in her mom's mind. What's this all about? Nothing, I was just wondering. Her dad laughed. Sorry, Soybean. We're your parents, whether you like it or not. Okay, she agreed, but she wasn't so sure anymore.